Day 8, 150 militants dead. Not a single boot on Malian soil. On May 3, 2026, the AES Alliance entered Day 8 of continuous airstrikes over Mali. Times Now World confirmed the body count. 150 militants eliminated from the sky. The press asked the same question they've been asking since April 25th. Where is Ibrahim Traoré? Here's what they didn't ask. Why would the chairman of the AES, the man who built an 85,000-strong volunteer defense force in Burkina Faso, refuse to send a single soldier across the border while Mali's junta begged for ground troops? The Mali junta wanted saviors. Traoré gave them a mirror. And what that mirror reflected, what it forced Mali to see after 8 days of airstrikes and zero ground deployment, is the most important lesson in Pan-African strategy since independence. Because this wasn't about Mali's military strength. It wasn't about whether the AES had the capacity to deploy 15,000 troops they'd already approved on April 16th. This was about a pattern that's repeated for 60 years, a pattern where African nations are told over and over that sovereignty can be outsourced, that security must come from foreign troops, that legitimacy requires external validation. External forces tried it, 3 different models: foreign military intervention, UN peacekeeping, private military contractors. All 3 left Mali. All 3 failed. Day 8 was the moment Traoré refused to be next on that list. And if you've ever wondered why one of Africa's most strategic leaders chose silence over intervention, chose airstrikes over boots on the ground, chose teaching over saving, this video is the answer they never wanted you to have. Because the decision Traoré made on Day 8 didn't just change Mali's future. It rewrote the playbook for every African nation watching. April 25th, 2026. 4:56 a.m. 10,000 militants attacked 6 cities across Mali: Gao, Timbuktu, Kidal, Menaka, Ansongo, Burim. Simultaneous strikes, coordinated timing. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion. Defense Minister Sadio Kamara was killed at his home in Kati before the first shot was fired in the cities. Not during the battle. Before it. Records indicate he was eliminated in the early hours of April 25th, suggesting the attackers had precise intelligence on his location, his schedule, his security detail. The man responsible for Mali's military response was gone before Mali even knew it was under attack. President Assimi Goïta disappeared for 96 hours. No statement, no video, no confirmation he was alive. The press called it chaos. They called it collapse. They asked where Mali's leadership had gone. International outlets ran headlines predicting state failure. Regional analysts declared the Malian government had lost control. But while journalists were writing obituaries for the Malian state, something else was unfolding. Something that would expose every assumption the world had made about African security for the past 60 years. Africa Corps evacuated Kidal, not under fire, under escort, JNIM escort. The same rebels they were contracted to fight became their security detail on the way out. According to reports reviewed, Russian contractors left the city they were paid to defend, guided safely to the border by the militants they were hired to eliminate. No firefight, no last stand, no resistance. That's not a tactical retreat. That's a business decision. When the cost of staying exceeded the value of the contract, the contractors walked. The militants let them. May 2nd, Mali arrests its own soldiers, not for cowardice, for collaboration. Documents suggest Malian forces were feeding intelligence to JNIM, troop movements, supply routes, command locations, patrol schedules. This wasn't an external invasion that succeeded through superior firepower. This was an internal betrayal that made the invasion possible. The enemy wasn't just at the gate. The enemy had the keys. And according to Malian security sources, some of those keys had been handed over weeks before April 25th. The press narrative was simple. Mali is falling. Where is Traoré? Why isn't Burkina Faso sending troops? Why is the AES silent while its founding member collapses? But the press was asking the wrong question. The right question wasn't why Traoré stayed silent. The right question was why anyone expected him to repeat the same mistake the world had been making in Mali for 13 years. Because this wasn't Mali's first crisis, this was Mali's fourth model, and every single one had failed. Model 1, Foreign Military Intervention. 2013. France deploys Operation Serval. 3,000 troops, air support, armored units, attack helicopters. The mission, eliminate jihadist groups in the north. The result, jihadist groups pushed out of cities, regrouped in rural areas, expanded operations into neighboring countries. By 2022, the French military presence had grown to 5,000 troops. The violence had grown faster. Militant attacks increased from 212 incidents in 2013 to over 600 incidents in 2021. France left in 2022. The militants stayed. Model 2, United Nations Peacekeeping. MINUSMA deployed in 2013 with 13,000 personnel from 42 countries. The mandate, stabilize Mali, protect civilians, support the transition to democracy. The result, 435 peacekeepers killed over 10 years, the deadliest UN mission in the world. According to UN reports, MINUSMA cost $8.2 billion. Militant attacks increased every single year of the mission. In 2022 alone, there were over 700 violent incidents recorded in MINUSMA's area of operations. The UN left in 2023. The militants stayed. Model 3, Private Military Contractors. Africa Corps arrived in 2021. The pitch? We're not a foreign army, we're a business. We don't occupy, we operate. We don't nation build, we eliminate threats. We're not bound by UN mandates or political optics. We deliver results. The result? Kidal evacuation under militant escort in May 2026. They were paid to fight. They left under protection from the enemy. The contractors left, the militants stayed. 3 models, 13 years, billions of dollars, thousands of foreign personnel. One consistent outcome, failure. So when the press asked where Traoré was on day 8, they were really asking why he wasn't offering Mali a fourth version of the same broken model. Why he wasn't sending Burkinabe boots to Malian soil. Why he wasn't playing the role the external savior model had written for him. Why he wasn't repeating the pattern that had failed France, failed the UN, failed private contractors. But Traoré had already answered that question, not with words, with silence. And on May 3rd, 2026, day 8, that silence would be broken, not with troops, with airstrikes. 150 militants eliminated, 0 AES soldiers on Malian ground. Mali's junta begged for intervention. Traoré refused. The press called it cold. They called it calculated. They called it abandonment. But while the press counted bodies from the sky, something else was happening on the ground in Mali. Something that would validate every decision Traoré made in the 8 days that followed. The arrests weren't the worst part. On May 2nd, Mali detained its own soldiers for feeding intelligence to JNIM. Troop movements, supply routes, command locations. The enemy didn't break through Mali's defenses. They were invited in. But here's what the press didn't report. The intelligence briefings Traoré received in the 72 hours after April 25th contained something that would explain every decision he made over the next 8 days. And it had nothing to do with whether Mali's military was strong enough to fight. It had everything to do with whether Mali's military could be trusted at all. Because when your own soldiers are handing the keys to the enemy, sending more soldiers doesn't solve the problem. It makes the problem bigger. Traoré saw that. On day 1, the attack began at 4:56 in the morning. 2 groups, JNIM, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, Islamist ideology, global jihad, and the FLA, Tuareg separatists, secular, regional autonomy. On paper, they had nothing in common. In practice, they coordinated the assault on Tessalit with precision that suggested months of planning. France 24 published an analysis on May 1st. The headline read, Mali Crisis, a common enemy, but not a common project. The article outlined what military analysts had been whispering for weeks. JNIM and the FLA were ideologically incompatible. One wanted a caliphate, the other wanted a state, but both wanted Mali's government gone. And both knew that if AES ground troops crossed the border, the international narrative would shift overnight. The headline was already written. AES invades Mali. It didn't matter that Mali had requested the intervention. It didn't matter that 3 other models, foreign military presence, UN peacekeepers, private contractors, had already failed. The script was set, and JNIM knew it. On April 30th, JNIM released a statement. Not a threat, an invitation. The language was careful, deliberate. We called for a peaceful transition and a united front with all political parties who reject foreign interference. Peaceful transition, united front, political parties. This was language jihadist groups don't use. This was the vocabulary of legitimacy, of coalition building, of a group that understood optics better than most governments. Reports reviewed from that week show a pattern. JNIM wasn't just fighting, they were positioning. The blockade around Bamako tightened on April 30th. Supply routes were cut. But civilian infrastructure, water, electricity, hospitals, remained untouched. The message was clear. We're not here to destroy Mali. We're here to replace the people running it. And if AES sent troops, the narrative would flip. The group blocking Bamako wouldn't be the problem anymore. The foreign soldiers crossing the border would be. Traoré saw it. On day 1, while Mali's defense minister held press conferences, while the UN Security Council debated resolutions, while France 24 analysts wrote about fragile alliances, Traoré stayed silent. 6 days, April 26th to May 1st. No statements, no interviews, no emergency addresses to the nation, and the press called it cold. They called it abandonment. They called it proof that the AES Alliance was hollow. But silence isn't absent. Silence is a choice. Because while the world watched Tessalit fall, Traoré was reading intelligence briefings that told a different story. The story wasn't about whether JNIM and the FLA could hold territory. It was about whether Mali's own military could be trusted to defend it. And the answer, documented in the arrests on May 2nd, was no. Mali detained its own soldiers that day. Not for cowardice, not for incompetence, for treason. Troop movements had been leaked. Supply routes had been compromised. Command locations had been handed to the enemy. The intelligence briefings Traoré received in the 72 hours after April 25th showed a pattern of internal betrayal that made external intervention not just risky, but catastrophic. If you send reinforcements into a system where the enemy already has access to your communications, you're not reinforcing defense. You're feeding intelligence directly to the people you're trying to stop. Traoré understood what the press didn't. The external savior model, the idea that a stronger ally with better weapons and more soldiers could fix a broken system, had failed 3 times already in Mali. French forces couldn't stop the insurgency. UN peacekeepers couldn't stabilize the region. Private contractors couldn't secure the roads. And now, Mali's own defense structure was compromised from the inside. Sending AES troops into that environment wouldn't solve the problem. It would make the problem bigger. And it would hand JNIM the narrative they'd been building since April 30th. So Traoré stayed silent. Not because he didn't care, because he saw the script. The alliance was fragile. JNIM and the FLA had a common enemy, but not a common project. France 24 was right about that. But fragile doesn't mean weak, and temporary doesn't mean ineffective. The alliance only needed to hold long enough to bait AES into crossing the border. After that, the international headlines would do the rest. The timing was perfect, and the one person who saw it coming had been silent for 6 days, until he wasn't, quote, The alliance was fragile. Everyone knew that. JNIM, an Islamist group that wants Sharia law across the Sahel. The FLA, secular Tuareg separatists who want an independent Azawad state. Ideologically, they're opposites. Structurally, they shouldn't be able to coordinate a grocery run, let alone a 6-city invasion at 4:56 a.m. with precision timing. But they did. France 24 called it a common enemy, but not a common project. They were half right. The common enemy was obvious, Mali's Junta, backed by external forces. But the other half, the part about who benefits when that alliance inevitably collapses, the part about who wrote the script that made the alliance possible in the first place, that's what Traoré understood on day 1. And it's what the world would see by day 8. Traoré's silence wasn't abandonment. It was a lesson. the kind you can't teach with words. You have to let someone see it for themselves. And what Mali needed to see was a pattern that had been repeating for 13 years. A pattern so obvious that once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Foreign military forces arrived in Mali in January 2013. Operation Serval. France sent troops to push back an Islamist advance that threatened Bamako. They succeeded for a while, but by 2022, under mounting pressure from protests and diplomatic friction, they left. The mission had failed to deliver lasting stability. The UN arrived that same year. MINUSMA, 13,000 peacekeepers, a mandate to protect civilians and support the transition. By 2023, Mali's junta demanded they leave. The mission ended under threat. It had failed. Private contractors arrived in 2021. Wagner Group, later rebranded as Africa Corps. They promised what the others couldn't deliver, results without the political baggage. On April 26, 2026, they left Kidal under JNIM escort. According to a Small Wars Journal analysis published in March 2026, their withdrawal followed a collapse in community trust and operational effectiveness. They had failed. 3 models, 3 exits. Every external force that promised to save Mali eventually left, and the problems they were supposed to solve remain. Day 8 airstrikes killed an estimated 150 militants, according to reports reviewed by Times Now. That's significant. It buys time. It disrupts coordination, but it doesn't solve the structural problem. You can't airstrike your way to sovereignty. You can't outsource the work of building a state that your people trust. Traoré understood this on day 1. The fact that you're still watching means you already understand something most people refuse to see. That real change doesn't come from outside. It comes from the hard, unglamorous work of building systems that survive contact with reality. Remember that document we mentioned earlier, the one about human collapse? The Small Wars Journal piece that detailed how Africa Corps lost local intelligence networks because communities stopped cooperating? Traoré read it, or someone in his circle did, and he made a choice. He refused to repeat the mistake. His silence wasn't indecision. It was strategic discipline. He knew that if Burkina Faso deployed ground forces into northern Mali on day 2 or day 3, the international narrative would write itself. AES aggression, regional destabilization, proof that the alliance was a threat, not a solution. The same script that justified intervention in Libya, in Iraq, in a dozen other places where sovereignty was dismantled in the name of saving it. So he waited. He let Mali's government handle the immediate response. He let the airstrikes do what airstrikes do. And he let the world see what happens when you rely on external models that have already failed 3 times. This wasn't a test of Mali's strength. It was a mirror, a reflection of a choice every post-colonial state eventually faces. Do you keep calling for help from forces that have their own interests? Or do you build the capacity to defend yourself, even when it's slow, even when it's messy, even when the international community calls it dangerous? The external savior model has a perfect track record in Mali. It fails every time, not because the people involved are incompetent, but because the structure is designed to manage problems, not solve them. A foreign military force has a mandate, a timeline, and a home government that will eventually decide the cost isn't worth it. A UN mission has bureaucratic constraints and political limitations that make decisive action nearly impossible. A private contractor has a profit motive that doesn't align with long-term state building. Traoré didn't need to say any of this out loud. He just needed to let the pattern play out one more time. And by day 8, it was undeniable. Documents reviewed suggest that Malian forces, supported by airstrikes, had regained some tactical ground. But the deeper question remained: what happens when the airstrikes stop? What happens when the next crisis comes and there's no external force left to call? That's the question Traoré was forcing Mali to answer. Not with rhetoric, with reality. The alliance between JNIM and the FLA was always going to be fragile. We talked about that in the last section. Ideologically opposed, structurally incompatible. But it didn't need to last forever. It just needed to last long enough to expose the gap between what Mali's government could do on its own and what it needed external forces to do for it. And that gap, that's where sovereignty dies. Not in a single invasion, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the slow accumulation of dependencies that make it impossible to act without permission, without support, without someone else's script. This is what makes the May 2nd arrests so significant. Remember those? The internal betrayal we talked about at the beginning? Officers arrested for allegedly coordinating with external actors. That wasn't just about stopping a coup. It was about closing the gap, about eliminating the channels through which external scripts get written into internal decisions. Because here's what the external savior model requires to function. It needs people on the inside who believe the outside solution is the only solution. It needs officers who think their own government can't protect them. It needs officials who see foreign backing as more reliable than local legitimacy. And it needs a population that's been conditioned to look elsewhere for rescue. Mali had all of that for 13 years, and every time an external force left, the gap got wider. The dependency got deeper. The belief that Mali could handle its own security got weaker. Traore's silence was designed to interrupt that cycle, not by lecturing, not by intervening, but by creating a moment where Mali had to choose, rely on the same models that failed 3 times before, or start building something different, even if it's harder, even if it takes longer, even if the world calls it reckless. The airstrikes on day 8 weren't the answer. They were a placeholder, a way to buy time while the real work happens, the work of building intelligence networks that don't collapse when foreign contractors leave, the work of training forces that answer to Bamako, not Paris or Moscow or Washington, the work of creating a state that can survive without a savior. That's the mirror Traore held up. And by day 8, Mali was starting to see its own reflection. Traore had watched 3 external forces fail in Mali: foreign military, the UN, private contractors. Day 8 was the test of whether he'd learn from all 3, or repeat their mistakes. 3 external forces, 3 failures. Foreign military intervention left Mali in 2022 after 9 years. The violence was worse when they left than when they arrived. UN peacekeepers left in 2023 after losing 435 personnel and spending $8.2 billion. The militants expanded. Private contractors left Kidal in April 2026 under escort from the same rebels they were paid to eliminate. Every external force that promised to save Mali walked away. Every single one. Day 8 was the moment Traore refused to be next on that list. And the model he'd been building in Burkina Faso for 3 years, the one nobody in the international press wanted to talk about, was the reason why. Because what Traore understood, what Mali was being forced to see, is that airstrikes buy time, but only communities defend territory. The model had a name. Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDP, 85,731 volunteers in Burkina Faso as of March 2026. 3 times the number from 2 years earlier. Not mercenaries, not foreign contractors, not UN peacekeepers rotating out every 6 months. Community members defending their own territory. The model Traore had been building since 2023, the model nobody in the international press wanted to examine too closely. Because if it worked, it meant everything the external savior model promised was a lie. Small Wars Journal published a field assessment in March 2026. The title was direct: Why Africa Corps Failed, where VDP succeeded. The conclusion was harder. External forces, no matter how well armed, cannot hold territory without community trust. Africa Corps arrived in Mali with advanced equipment, air support, and funding. But they had no local intelligence, no legitimacy, no reason for a farmer in Kidal to tell them where the militants were hiding. When a convoy rolls through your village speaking Russian, wearing foreign uniforms, answering to commanders you've never met, you don't share what you know. You wait for them to leave. The VDP model worked differently. Volunteers came from the villages they defended. They knew the terrain, they knew the families, they knew who belonged and who didn't. They knew which truck didn't belong in the market on Tuesday morning, which stranger asked too many questions at the well, which route the militants used when they thought no one was watching. That's not romance, that's operational advantage. The kind external forces can't buy, can't train, can't replicate. The Robert Lansing Institute confirmed it with data. Armed groups in Mali expanded their territorial control by 14% between January 2024 and March 2026. The same period Africa Corps was operating. The external force didn't stop the militants. It gave them space to grow. Because when communities don't trust the people with guns, they don't share information. And without information, even the best trained force is blind. French military intervention spent 9 years in Mali, left in 2022. The violence was worse when they departed than when they arrived. UN peacekeepers spent a decade, lost 435 personnel, spent $8.2 billion. The militants expanded. Private contractors left Kidal in April 2026 under escort from the same rebels they were paid to eliminate. 3 external models, 3 failures. And that's what was happening to Africa Corps. The external savior model doesn't fail because of bad intentions. It fails because it's structurally incapable of doing what it promises. Day 8 was the test of whether Traore understood that, and whether Mali could learn it. Because the airstrikes on May 8th weren't the solution. They were the placeholder, a way to buy time while the real work happened. The work of building a VDP network in Mali. The work of training volunteers who answer to Bamako, not Moscow or Paris or Washington. The work of creating a defense structure that doesn't collapse the moment external support leaves. That's what Traoré had done in Burkina Faso. 85,000 volunteers, 3 times growth in 2 years. The model was working. Day 8 was the moment Mali and the world would see if it could work anywhere else. The AES approved 15,000 troops on April 16th. Joint deployment, solidarity in action. But by May 8th, those troops hadn't crossed the border. Not because of logistics, not because of hesitation, because Traoré was teaching Mali the same lesson he'd learned in Burkina Faso. External forces leave, communities stay. If Mali wanted to survive the next crisis, it couldn't wait for 15,000 AES troops to arrive. It had to build its own VDP network. And that takes time. It takes trust. It takes a willingness to let communities lead their own defense, even when it's messy, even when it's slower than calling in airstrikes. The arrests on May 2nd, the ones that triggered the crisis, happened because Mali's intelligence network collapsed. No human intelligence, no community trust, just a gap that militants walked through. The VDP model closes that gap, not with technology, not with foreign advisors, with farmers and teachers and shopkeepers who know their own villages better than any external analyst ever will. Traore's silence for 7 days wasn't indifference. It was a teaching tool, a mirror held up to Mali. You've relied on French military. They left. You've relied on UN peacekeepers. They left. You've relied on private contractors. They left in April under escort from the same rebels they were paid to eliminate. Every external force that promised to save you walked away. Every single one. Day 8 was the moment Traoré refused to let Mali add AES to that list. Because if Burkina Faso and Niger deployed 15,000 troops and solved the crisis, Mali would learn the wrong lesson. It would learn that salvation comes from outside, that someone else will always arrive to fix the problem. And the next time militants took hostages, Mali would wait for the phone to ring instead of building the intelligence networks that prevent the kidnapping in the first place. The airstrikes on Day 8 were solidarity, but they were also a deadline. AES bought Mali time. Now use it, build your VDP network, train your volunteers, create the community defense structures that don't need a savior, because the next crisis is coming. And when it does, there might not be 15,000 troops waiting on the other side of the border. There might just be 85,731 volunteers in Burkina Faso, proving that communities can defend themselves if someone gives them the tools and gets out of the way. That's the blueprint Traoré was offering. Not a rescue, a model. One that Mali could adopt, adapt, and own. The question on Day 8 wasn't whether AES would intervene. The question was whether Mali would learn from 3 failed external models and start building something that lasts. 85,000 volunteers, 3 times growth in 2 years. The model was working in Burkina Faso. Day 8 was the moment Mali and the world would see if it could work anywhere else. Day 8 wasn't a rescue mission, it was a lesson. And the lesson was this: sovereignty isn't something you're given, it's something you build. Traoré didn't abandon Mali for 7 days. He gave them a mirror, a chance to see what 60 years of dependency had created. A security apparatus that collapsed the moment external forces left. An intelligence network that couldn't prevent a kidnapping in its own capital. A government that still believed salvation would arrive from outside if they just waited long enough. The airstrikes on May 8th weren't proof that AES would always come. They were proof that Mali had 7 days to realize no one was coming. And that realization, uncomfortable as it was, might be the most valuable thing Traoré ever gave them. Because here's what the silence revealed. Mali's defense infrastructure was designed for external support. French military provided air cover for 9 years. When they left, Mali called UN peacekeepers. When peacekeepers withdrew, Mali hired private contractors. When contractors fled Kidal in April under escort from the same rebels they were paid to eliminate, Mali looked to AES. The pattern was clear. Every crisis triggered the same reflex: call for help, wait for someone else to solve it. And that reflex, more than any militant group, was the real threat to Mali's sovereignty. Because external forces leave. They always leave. French military left in 2022. UN peacekeepers left in 2023. Africa Corps was failing in real time by March 2026. The external savior model doesn't fail because of bad intentions. It fails because it's structurally temporary. And you can't build a nation on something temporary. Traoré understood that. He'd lived it. Burkina Faso faced the same militant threats Mali did. The same kidnappings, the same territorial losses, the same international pressure to accept external military support. And Traoré said no. Not because he didn't want help, because he understood that help which doesn't build local capacity is just dependency with better branding. So he built the VDP network, 85,731 volunteers as of March 2026, 3 times the number from 2 years earlier. Community members defending their own territory, not waiting for a convoy from Ouagadougou, not waiting for air support from Niamey, not waiting for anyone. And it worked. Not perfectly, not without losses, but it worked in a way no external force ever had, because the volunteers knew the terrain, they knew the families, they knew which truck didn't belong in the market on Tuesday morning. That's not romance. That's operational intelligence, the kind you can't import. Day 8 was the moment Traoré offered that model to Mali, not as a replacement for AES solidarity, as a foundation. The airstrikes bought time, now use it. Build your own VDP network. Train volunteers who answer to Bamako, not Moscow or Paris or Washington. Create defense structures that don't collapse when external support leaves. Because the next crisis is coming. And when it does, there might not be 15,000 troops waiting on the other side of the border. There might just be communities in Burkina Faso proving that Africans can defend Africa if someone stops telling them they need to be saved. That's the blueprint, not a rescue. A mirror, one that reflects 60 years of dependency and asks a single question: how much longer are you going to wait for someone else to build your sovereignty? The silence wasn't cruelty, it was respect. Traoré treated Mali like an equal capable of learning a hard lesson, not a child that needed to be protected from reality. And that respect, more than any airstrike, might be what the AES was really built on. Not the promise that we'll always save you, the promise that we'll show you how to save yourself, and then we'll stand beside you while you do it. That's what Day 8 revealed. Not whether AES would intervene, whether Mali was ready to stop waiting for intervention and start building the structures that make it unnecessary. 85,000 volunteers, 3 times growth in 2 years. The model was working. The question was whether Mali would adopt it or keep waiting for the next external force to arrive and eventually leave. If this video changed how you see sovereignty in Africa, if you finally understand why Traoré refused to send troops for 7 days, here's what I need you to do. Hit that like button, because YouTube needs to know this perspective exists. Share this with someone who still believes Africa needs to be saved by outsiders. And drop the mirror your country in one thing this video changed in how you see the AES in the comments. Let's see who's actually paying attention. There's a video on this channel that breaks down exactly how the VDP model works, the 85,000 volunteers, the 3-year timeline, the structural differences from every external force that failed. If you want to understand what Traore's been building while the world wasn't watching, that's where you go next.